The summer heat pressed down on the Dakota Territory like a blacksmith's hammer, and Marisol Vega walked the same dusty path she'd walked for 3 months running. 2 wooden buckets swung from her calloused hands, empty now, but soon to be filled, from the creek that lay 2 miles beyond the nearest ridge. Her rounded belly made each step a small act of defiance against a world that seemed determined to break her spirit. She was 7 months along, abandoned by a husband who'd promised her a new life in America, left with nothing but a worthless homestead claim and the stubborn pride that kept her moving forward. The other settlers whispered behind their hands. When she passed through town, a Mexican woman, alone and expecting, hauling water like a beast of burden. But what they didn't know was that Colton McRae had been watching her from his distant ranch, and something about her quiet determination had stirred feelings he'd buried along with his first family. Would a hardened cattle baron's unexpected kindness become the salvation they both desperately needed? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Dakota Territory, painting the endless grassland in shades of gold and amber. Marisol Vega had learned to measure time not by clocks, but by the rhythm of her daily pilgrimage to the creek. 2 miles. There, 2 miles back, carrying enough water to sustain another day of stubborn survival on a homestead that seemed determined to defeat her. She paused at the edge of her property line, setting down the buckets to rest her aching back. The weight of 7 months' pregnancy, combined with the relentless prairie heat, made every step a small victory against the odds. Her calloused hands, once soft enough to embroider delicate flowers on Sunday dresses, now bore the permanent stains of hard labor and harder choices. The cabin behind her stood like a weathered testament to broken promises. Miguel had sworn it would be their palace in the new country, a place where their children would grow strong and free. Instead, it was little more than 4 walls and a leaking roof, chinked with mud and hope that had long since dried to dust. The single room held everything she owned: a narrow bed, a rough-hewn table, 2 chairs he'd made before his restlessness overtook his carpentry skills, and a trunk that contained the tattered remains of her former life. She'd arrived here in the spring of 1884, pregnant with possibility, and a husband who spoke of gold strikes and railroad fortunes waiting just over the next ridge. Miguel Guerrero had the kind of easy charm that made promises sound like prayers, and she'd followed him from the green valleys of New Mexico into this sea of grass with the faith of a woman in love. But charm, she'd learned, was a poor substitute for character, and promises were just words until they were kept. The morning he'd ridden away, ostensibly to seek work in the railroad camps, he'd kissed her forehead and sworn he'd return before the first snow, with money enough to buy proper livestock and perhaps even hire help for the harvest. That was 3 months ago. The letters had stopped coming after the first 2 weeks, and the supplies he'd promised to send never arrived. She'd been alone since, save for the growing life within her and the occasional visits from neighbors who offered pity disguised as Christian charity. Miles to the north, on a rise that overlooked nearly 10,000 acres of prime grazing land, Colton McRae stood at his bedroom window, watching a small figure move across the distant prairie. Even at this distance, he could make out the familiar silhouette, the careful gait of a woman carrying precious cargo, both in her arms and beneath her heart. He'd been watching her daily treks for weeks now, telling himself it was merely the natural concern of one neighbor for another, though something deeper stirred in his chest each time he saw her. At 43, Colton had built his empire through a combination of military precision, relentless work, and the kind of strategic thinking that had once made him valuable to the Confederacy as a scout. His ranch house reflected the same methodical approach, solid, functional, built to last through prairie storms and harder seasons. Unlike Marisol's desperate little cabin, every board had been carefully selected, every joint properly mortised. every detail planned with the thoroughness of a man who understood that in this country, the difference between comfort and catastrophe often came down to preparation. But the house felt hollow, despite its solid construction. In the front parlor, dust motes danced through sunbeams that illuminated empty spaces where a family's laughter should have echoed. A child's wooden horse sat motionless in the corner, carved by his own hands for a son who would never ride it. Sarah's sewing basket remained exactly where she'd left it beside her favorite chair, needles still threaded with blue cotton, waiting for hands that would never return to finish the tiny shirt she'd been making. The fever had taken them in the winter of 1881. First little Thomas, barely 4 years old, then Sarah herself, just 3 days later. He'd buried them on the hill behind. The house, beneath 2 cottonwood trees that had somehow found purchase in the unforgiving soil. The fire that destroyed their original cabin 6 months later seemed almost like a mercy, erasing the physical reminders of what he'd lost while leaving the deeper scars untouched. He'd rebuilt everything except his capacity for hope. The Confederate Scout medal lay hidden in his desk drawer, wrapped in oiled cloth, alongside other remnants of a war that had taught him about loss long before personal tragedy refined the lesson. He'd served with distinction, leading reconnaissance missions deep into Union territory, gathering intelligence that had helped turn the tide of more than one battle. But distinction in a losing cause was just another form of failure, and he'd come west to forget both his victories and his defeats. Now, watching Marisol's solitary figure disappear behind the creekside cottonwoods, he felt something he'd thought buried with Sarah and Thomas, the protective instinct that had once made him a good soldier and a devoted husband. It was an uncomfortable feeling, like blood returning to a limb that had been numb too long. The town of Cedar Falls lay 7 miles southeast of his ranch, a collection of frame buildings and false hopes that had sprung up around the promise of a railroad spur that never materialized. The general store, saloon, church, and handful of other establishments served the scattered homesteaders and ranchers with a mixture of necessity and judgment that seemed particularly harsh when it came to Marisol Vega. He'd witnessed their whispered conversations, seen the way conversations stopped when she entered Hutchins' general store with her carefully counted coins and precise shopping list. A Mexican woman, alone and expecting, claiming a homestead without a husband present to vouch for her character. She represented everything the community found threatening about the changing times. That she conducted herself with quiet dignity and paid her debts promptly seemed to matter less than the color of her skin and the circumstances of her situation. Colton had his own complicated relationship with the town's opinion. His success and relatively recent arrival had earned him a grudging respect, but he remained an outsider by choice rather than circumstance. He attended church sporadically, participated in community barn raisings when invited, and paid his bills without complaint. But he'd built his life deliberately apart from the social fabric that bound most of his neighbors together. Perhaps that's why Marisol's situation resonated with him more than it should have. They were both exiles in their own ways, she by circumstance and prejudice, he by grief and choice. Both carrying burdens that bent their backs but hadn't yet broken their spirits. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of approaching weather across the grassland. Another storm was building to the west, the kind that could bring relief from the heat or destruction from the sky, depending on its temperament. He watched until Marisol's figure reappeared, buckets full now, beginning the long trek back to her cabin. Something in her determined pace spoke to the part of him that had once led men through enemy territory on nothing but faith and stubborn will. As the first fat raindrops began to spatter against his window, Colton McRae made a decision that would alter the course of 2 lives. Tomorrow he would find a reason to ride past the creek when she made her daily journey. Not to interfere, he understood pride well enough to respect hers, but simply to be present. Sometimes, he'd learned, The difference between survival and surrender was as simple as knowing someone else bore witness to your struggle. The storm broke fully as darkness fell, drumming against the roof with the insistence of nature asserting its dominance over human plans. In her little cabin, Marisol lay listening to the rain and feeling her baby stir restlessly within her. Miles away, Colton sat in his empty parlor, polishing a cavalry revolver he hadn't touched in months, preparing. For a conversation he wasn't sure how to begin. Neither slept well that night, though neither could have explained why the coming day felt charged with possibility and change. The handle on Marisol's water pump snapped with a sound like breaking bones, the rusted metal finally surrendering to weeks of increasing strain. She stared at the useless piece of iron in her hand, feeling the weight of this new catastrophe settle over her like a heavy blanket. The well Miguel had dug was shallow and unreliable, producing only a trickle even when the pump worked properly. Now, with the mechanism broken and no money for repairs, her daily trek to the creek wasn't just routine. It was survival. The heat had been building for 3 days, the kind of suffocating pressure that made the air shimmer like water, and drove even the hardiest prairie creatures to seek shelter in whatever shade they could find. Marisol had been rationing her water carefully, using barely enough to keep herself and the tiny seedlings in her kitchen garden alive. The broken pump handle felt like a judgment from an unforgiving sky. She wrapped the metal fragment in a cloth and placed it carefully in her pocket. Perhaps Hutchins at the general store could order a replacement, though she doubted her remaining. Coins would cover the cost. The baby kicked sharply, as if sensing her distress, and she placed both hands on her swollen belly. "Patience, little one," she whispered in Spanish, the language of her childhood prayers. "Your mama will find a way." But as she prepared for the longer journey to the creek, filling both buckets plus the extra mason jars she'd been saving, Marisol felt the familiar weight of desperation pressing against her chest. 8 months pregnant, walking 4 miles in. Heat that could fell a strong man. It was madness. It was also the only choice she had. The sun was merciless by the time she reached the halfway point, a small rise that offered no shade, but at least provided a view of the creek below. Her dress clung to her body with perspiration, and dark spots danced at the edges of her vision. She set down the buckets and jars, pressing her hands against her lower back, where the muscles screamed in protest. That's when she saw him. Colton. McGray sat motionless on his horse, perhaps 50 yards away, close enough that she could see the concern etched in his weathered features. He'd been watching her struggle, she realized, probably for some time. The knowledge should have embarrassed her, but she was too exhausted for pride. He dismounted slowly, as if approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. His horse, a magnificent bay gelding, stood perfectly still as he walked toward her, his boots crunching softly on the sun-baked earth. "Mrs. Vega," he said, touching the brim of his hat. His voice carried the careful courtesy of a man who understood the delicate nature of the situation. "Mighty hot day for such a long walk." Marisol straightened as much as her condition allowed, trying to summon the dignity that had carried her through months of whispered judgments and sidelong glances. Mr. McRae. She knew his name, though they'd never been formally introduced. Everyone in the territory knew Colton McRae. "I was riding to check the creek levels," he continued, though they both knew it was a lie told for the sake of her pride. "Noticed you might be feeling the heat." He gestured toward the shade of a lone cottonwood that grew near the water's edge. "Might be wise to rest a spell before heading back." She wanted to refuse, to maintain the independence that had become her armor against the world's harsh judgments, but her body betrayed her, swaying slightly as another wave of dizziness washed over her. Colton stepped forward instinctively, then stopped himself, understanding that she hadn't given permission for such intimacy. "I'm fine," she managed, but the words came out breathless and unconvincing. "Ma'am, I've seen soldiers fall from less heat than this," he said gently, "and they weren't carrying the extra burden you're bearing." The directness of his acknowledgement of her pregnancy surprised her. Most people either ignored her condition entirely or treated it like a shameful secret. His matter-of-fact acceptance felt like a small kindness in a world that had offered precious few. "My pump is broken," she found herself saying, as if the confession might explain everything. "The handle snapped this morning." He nodded gravely, as if she'd shared intelligence of vital strategic importance. "That's a considerable problem. How long has it been giving you trouble?" "Weeks, maybe longer." She touched her belly unconsciously. "I've been making do with what I could coax from it, but now you're walking 4 miles in weather fit to cook a man." He moved to his horse and untied a canvas-wrapped bundle from behind the saddle. "I've got water here, and some jerky if you're hungry. No sense in both of us suffering for the sake of propriety." Marisol hesitated. Accepting help from a man, especially this man, whose reputation for keeping to himself was matched only by his obvious prosperity, felt dangerous. Not physically, but in ways that went deeper. She'd spent months proving to herself and the community that she could survive alone. Taking charity from Colton McRae might undermine everything she'd worked to establish, but the baby kicked again, hard enough to make her gasp, and she realized that pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Thank you," she said quietly, allowing him to guide her toward the shade. The cottonwood's branches offered blessed relief from the sun's assault. Colton unstopped his water bottle and offered it to her without ceremony. She drank deeply, feeling the cool liquid restore some clarity. "And to her thoughts, better?" he asked. She nodded, studying his face in the dappled light. He was older than she'd initially thought, probably in his 40s, with lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent squinting into prairie distances. His hands, she noticed, bore the calluses of genuine work despite his obvious success. There was something in his expression, a careful gentleness that seemed at odds with his reputation as a stern, solitary man. "I should get back," she said, though she made no move to rise. "The water won't carry itself." "About that," Colton said, settling back on his heels. "I've got more containers back at the ranch, and a mule that's been eating my hay without earning." Her keep. Might be she'd welcome the exercise. Marisol stiffened. "I don't need charity, Mr. McRae." "No, ma'am. I don't imagine you do." He pulled a stem of grass and chewed it thoughtfully. "But I need help with a problem, and it occurs to me we might be able to work something out." She waited, suspicious but curious. "I've got a vegetable garden that's been neglected since—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Since I lost my wife. Good soil, established beds, but I don't have the knowledge or the inclination to tend it properly. Seems a waste to let it go to seed when there's someone nearby who might know what to do with it." It was a transparent fiction, but offered with such careful dignity that Marisol felt her resistance wavering. "What exactly are you proposing?" Trade. You help me salvage what's left of the growing season, and I'll make sure you have reliable access to water. The mule, some proper containers. Maybe even get that pump of yours working again." The offer hung between them like a bridge across troubled water. Marisol knew accepting would change something fundamental about her situation. She'd no longer be the woman who'd survived alone against all odds. She'd be the woman who'd needed help from Colton McRae. But as she watched a hawk circle overhead, riding the thermals with effortless grace, she wondered if perhaps there was wisdom in knowing when to accept the wind's assistance rather than fighting it. "I know vegetables," she said finally. "My mother taught me. Then we have the foundation of a bargain." He stood and extended his hand to help her up. "Shall we get you and this water back to your place? We can discuss the details once you're out of this heat." As they loaded her containers into his saddlebags and he helped her mount behind him on the big bay, Marisol felt the first stirring of something she'd almost forgotten. Hope. It was fragile and uncertain, but it was there. The ride back to her cabin took only minutes, but word of it would spread through Cedar Falls by evening. She could already imagine the conversations, Colton McRae and the Mexican woman riding, together bold as brass. The gossip would be unkind, she knew, but as she felt the baby settle more comfortably in her belly and the blessed relief of not having to walk those final miles, she found she cared less about the town's judgment than she had in months. Change was coming, whether she was ready or not. And for the first time since Miguel's departure, she wondered if change might not be the enemy she'd always assumed it to be. Marisol knelt before the small wooden cross she'd mounted on the wall beside her bed, her mother's rosary beads smooth and warm between her fingers. The familiar ritual of prayer offered comfort in the pre-dawn darkness when doubts crept in like cold air through the cabin's chinks. She spoke to her mother in whispered Spanish, seeking guidance about the decision that had kept her awake most of the night. "What would you do, Mama?" she asked the silent cross. "Would you trust him?" The cross, carved from mesquite wood by her father's hands decades ago, offered no answers beyond the peace that came from touching something her mother had touched, had prayed before during her own times of uncertainty. Maria Santos had been a woman of practical faith, one who believed that God helped those who helped themselves, but wasn't too proud to accept assistance when it came from genuine hearts. A sound outside interrupted her prayer, the soft nickering of a horse and the creak of leather. Marisol rose carefully, pressing her hand to her lower back, and peered through the single window. In the growing light, she could make out Colton McRae leading a sturdy brown mule toward her door, a large wooden barrel strapped to the animal's back. She opened the door before he could knock, stepping out into the cool morning air. He touched his hat brim in greeting, his expression carefully neutral. "Morning, Mrs. Vega. Brought that mule I mentioned, if the offer still stands." The animal was clearly well cared for, her coat glossy and her tack in excellent repair. She stood patiently while Colton untied the barrel, which Marisol now saw was fitted with a proper spigot and mounted on a simple wooden frame. "This is too much," she said. Though her eyes lingered on the barrel's generous size, it would hold enough water for several days, maybe a week if she was careful. "It's a loan," Colton said firmly. "The mule's name is Rosie. She's gentle but stubborn, so you'll need to be firm with her. The barrel's got a slow leak near the bottom, which is why I'm not using it anymore. Figured you might not mind working around that." Marisol approached the mule slowly, extending her hand for the animal to sniff. Rosie's soft muzzle brushed against her palm, and she felt some of her tension ease. "She's beautiful. She's practical," Colton corrected, but there was warmth in his voice. "Bred for endurance rather than speed. She'll carry that barrel to the creek and back without complaint, long as you treat her fair. What do you want in return?" The question came out more sharply than she'd intended, born from months of learning that nothing came without cost. Colton was quiet for a moment, studying the distant horizon as if weighing his words. "I meant what I said about the garden. It's going to waste, and that seems like a sin when there's folks who could benefit from it. But if you're asking what I really want," he turned to meet her eyes directly, "I want to know that you and that baby are going to be all right. Call it the instincts of an old soldier, if you like. I don't sleep well when I know there's unnecessary suffering happening within my area of responsibility." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard. She'd expected conditions, obligations, the subtle chains that came with accepting help from men. Instead, he spoke with the matter-of-fact directness of someone offering assistance to a fellow traveler on a difficult road. "I don't know anything about managing mules," she admitted. "Rosie will teach you what you need to know. She's patient with beginners." He untied a canvas bag from the barrel frame and handed it to her. "Feeds in here, along with some basic tack care supplies. The garden's about a quarter-mile north of my house if you decide you want to take a look at it." "Just like that. You'll trust me with your animal. You've been walking 8 miles a day in this heat, rather than ask for help. That tells me something about your character." He adjusted his hat, preparing to leave. "Besides, Rosie's got her own opinions about people. If she didn't like you, she'd have let you know by now." After he'd gone, Marisol spent the morning getting acquainted with her new temporary companion. Rosie proved to be exactly as advertised, gentle but opinionated, willing to work but insistent on doing things her own way. The trip to the creek, which had become such an ordeal on foot, took less than an hour with the mule's help. Loading the full barrel required some experimentation and considerable effort, but the satisfaction of returning home with several days' worth of water made the work feel like victory rather than drudgery. That afternoon, curiosity got the better of her. She'd promised herself a brief rest after the morning's exertions, but found herself walking north toward Colton's property, following the fence line that marked the boundary between his prosperity and her persistence. The garden, when she found it, broke her heart a little. Someone, his dead wife, she assumed, had laid it out with obvious skill and love. The beds were properly oriented to catch the morning sun while avoiding the worst heat of midday. A sophisticated system of channels and small dams had been designed to direct rainwater where it was needed most. Even now, months into neglect, she could see the bones of what had once been a masterpiece of practical horticulture. Weeds had taken over most of the space, but underneath their aggressive growth, she spotted the survivors. Tomato plants gone wild, but still producing small, tough fruit. A patch of beans that had somehow managed to climb their stakes despite the competition. Herbs that had reverted to their natural hardiness and continued to thrive in defiance of abandonment. She was kneeling beside a row of onions, pulling the worst of the weeds away from their struggling green shoots, when she heard footsteps behind. "Her! You're early," Colton said. "I figured it would take you at least a week to work up the courage to come look." "I was curious," she said, not looking up from her work. "Your wife knew what she was doing. This could feed a family through winter. Properly managed, could it be saved this late in the season?" Marisol sat back on her heels, surveying the chaos with the eye of someone who'd learned gardening at her mother's side. Some of it. The herbs and onions, certainly. The beans might give you a small harvest if we can get them properly supported. The tomatoes, she gestured toward the wild tangle of vines. They're producing, but the fruit's small and tough. Still good for preserving, though. And next year, this could be magnificent again. The words came out with more passion than she'd intended. The soil is good, the layout is perfect, and the infrastructure is all here. It just needs someone who cares about it. Colton was quiet for a long moment, watching her hands as she continued to work among the struggling plants. "Sarah spent 3 years getting it established," he said finally. "Always said it would be something to pass down to our children." His voice carried old pain, carefully controlled. "Seemed wrong to just let it die after she was gone, but I didn't have the heart to tend it myself." Marisol understood the weight of grief that could make even simple tasks feel impossible. She'd felt it herself when her father died, when the familiar rhythms of life became reminders of loss rather than comfort. Sometimes we have to let others care for the things we love, until we're strong enough to love them again ourselves. When she looked up, she found him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You really think it can be brought back?" "I know it can. It'll take work and time and patience, but yes." She gestured toward a section where the weeds were thinner. "We could start there, clear one bed at a time, salvage what we can this season, and plan for the next." "We?" The word hung between them, carrying implications that had nothing to do with gardening and everything to do with the careful dance they'd been performing around each other's boundaries. "If you'll have me," she said quietly. "I miss working with growing things, and—" she touched her belly, where the baby seemed to be listening to their conversation. "I want my child to understand where food comes from, to know the satisfaction of nurturing something from seed to harvest. Then I reckon we have ourselves a partnership." He extended his hand to help her up, and for the first time, she took it without hesitation. As they walked back toward her cabin in the golden light of late afternoon, Rosie trailing behind them with the empty water barrel, Marisol felt something shift inside her chest. Not love, it was far too early for such dangerous emotions, but perhaps the first tentative stirring of trust. And in a world that had taught her to expect disappointment, trust felt like a small miracle worth nurturing. The storm struck without. Warning, just as Marisol was securing the last of the tomato plants to their stakes. The sky, which had been merely overcast when she'd started working in the garden that morning, suddenly darkened to the color of old pewter. Wind whipped across the prairie with enough force to bend the grass nearly horizontal, and the first drops of rain felt like thrown pebbles against her skin. She was too far from her cabin to make it home safely, her condition making rapid movement. Impossible. The nearest shelter was Colton's ranch house, perhaps 300 yards through increasingly violent weather. As lightning split the sky and thunder answered with a sound like cannon fire, she abandoned dignity in favor of survival and hurried toward his porch as quickly as her swollen body would allow. Colton met her at the door before she could knock, his face grim with concern. "Get inside, quickly now." He helped her across the threshold just as the sky opened fully, releasing a torrent that drummed against the windows with frightening intensity. "I'm sorry," she gasped, dripping onto his carefully maintained floors. "I couldn't make it home in time." "Don't apologize for having sense," he said, hanging her soaked shawl on a peg by the door. "This kind of storm can turn deadly fast. You did exactly right." As he moved to light additional lamps against the storm's darkness, Marisol found herself taking in details of his home that she'd been too polite to notice during her brief previous visits. The furniture was solid and well-made, speaking of prosperity, but not ostentation. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel decorated with a few carefully chosen objects. A clock, a small frame photograph, a pair of candlesticks that showed the patina of regular use. But it was the smaller details that told the real story. A child's wooden horse in the corner, its paint worn smooth by small hands. A woman's sewing basket beside the fireplace, needle still threaded, as if its owner had simply stepped away for a moment. Books stacked on a side table, some with ribbons marking places that would never be returned to. Colton noticed her observation. "I should have put those things away," he said quietly. "Just never seemed to find the right time." "Why should you?" Marisol settled carefully into the chair he indicated, grateful for its solid comfort. "They're part of your history, part of what made this a home." He was quiet for a moment, studying the photograph on the mantel. "Sarah always said homes were meant to hold memories, not just furniture. Figured I'd honor that, even if it makes for lonely evenings sometimes." Thunder crashed overhead, followed immediately by lightning that illuminated the room in stark white relief. Marisol instinctively placed her hands on her belly, feeling the baby respond to her quickened heartbeat with restless movement. "How far along are you?" Colton asked, settling into the chair across from her with the careful distance of a man mindful of propriety. 8 months, near as I can figure." She smoothed her dress over the pronounced curve. "Sometimes it feels like forever, sometimes like there's no time at all. Are you prepared? For when the time comes, I mean." The question carried weight beyond mere curiosity. Out here, childbirth was a dangerous passage that claimed mothers and babies with frightening regularity. The nearest doctor was in Cedar Falls, 7 miles of rough road that could become impassable. In weather like this, as much as one can be, I suppose. She tried to keep her voice steady, but uncertainty crept in around the edges. "There's a midwife in town, Mrs. Henderson. She's promised to come when I send word." Mrs. Henderson's good people delivered half the babies in the territory, including Sarah's. He stopped himself, the unfinished sentence hanging heavy between them. "Your son," Marisol said gently. "Thomas, I heard about what happened. I'm sorry." Colton's hands gripped the arms of his chair, knuckles white against the worn fabric. Fever took him first. Sarah tried to nurse him through it, barely slept for 5 days. When he died, she just collapsed, like her will to live died with him. "Grief can be a sickness all its own," Marisol said. "When my father died, my mother used to say she could feel her heart trying to follow him. It took months before she remembered how to want to keep living. But she did remember." eventually. She said watching me helped her realize that love doesn't end when people die. It just changes shape, becomes something you carry forward instead of something you share in the moment. The storm continued its assault on the house, but inside, warmed by lamplight and unexpected intimacy, they found themselves sharing stories that neither had told to anyone else. Marisol spoke of her childhood in New Mexico, of learning to tend gardens from her mother and horses from her father, of meeting Miguel at a church dance and being swept away by his dreams of prosperity in the Northern Territories. Colton told her about his war years, carefully editing out the worst of what he'd seen, but conveying the bone-deep weariness that came from too much loss, witnessed too young. He spoke of meeting Sarah at a church social in Kansas, of their careful courtship conducted through letters when his scouting duties took him away for weeks at a time. "She was the steadiest person I ever knew," he said, his voice soft with memory. "Never lost her temper, never complained about the hardships. Even during Thomas's illness, she just endured. Maybe that's what killed her in the end. All that strength turned inward with nowhere to go." "Strength can become its own burden," Marisol agreed. "Sometimes I think my mother would have lived longer if she'd allowed herself to be weak occasionally, if she'd asked for help instead of always being the one others turned to, as if summoned." By their conversation about help and acceptance, the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly vigorous kick that made Marisol gasp and press her hand to her side. "You all right?" Colton was on his feet immediately, moving toward her with the quick reflexes of someone accustomed to emergencies. "Fine," she breathed, but her face had gone pale. "Just very active today. I think the storm has unsettled us both. Can I—" He hesitated, then gestured toward her belly. "Sarah used to say talking to them helped, that they could hear voices from outside." The request was intimate in a way that should have scandalized her, but there was such careful respect in his manner that she found herself nodding. He knelt beside her chair and placed his hand gently on the curve of her belly, speaking in the low, steady voice she imagined he'd once used to calm frightened horses. "Easy there, little one. No need to give your mama such a hard time. The storm's just noise, nothing that can hurt you in there." As if in response to his words, the baby settled, the frantic movement subsiding to gentle shifts and turns. Marisol stared down at Colton's weathered hand spanning her belly, at the careful tenderness in his touch, and felt something shift inside her chest that had nothing to do with pregnancy. "You'll be a good father," she said softly, "when the time comes again." He looked up at her then, his eyes dark with something that might have been hope or might have been fear. "I'm not sure I have that kind of courage left." "Courage isn't something you have or don't have," she said, covering his hand with her own. "It's something you choose, moment by moment, day by day, and you've been choosing it every day since you first offered me water." Outside, the storm was beginning to exhaust itself, the thunder growing more distant and the rain settling into a steady rhythm rather than a battering assault. But inside Colton's house, in the circle of lamplight that held them both, something new was being born, fragile as a seedling, but rooted in mutual recognition of shared wounds and careful hope. When the weather finally cleared enough for him to escort her home, they rode in comfortable silence, both understanding that something fundamental had changed between them. It wasn't love yet, neither was ready for such vulnerability, but it was the foundation upon which love might someday grow, solid and sure as the prairie soil that nurtured life from apparent emptiness. As September arrived with its promise of cooler nights and harvest time, Marisol's body began to betray her growing limitations. The baby had dropped lower, making walking more difficult but breathing easier. Her back ached constantly now, and simple tasks that had once been routine became monumental efforts. Yet she continued working in the garden, driven by both necessity and the deep satisfaction that came from coaxing life from the restored beds. It was during one of these morning sessions, as she carefully harvested the last of the summer beans, that she noticed the improvements Colton had made to her homestead. A new post here, reinforced fencing there, small repairs that appeared overnight like gifts from some benevolent spirit. When she confronted him about it, he'd shrugged and claimed he'd been riding by anyway, or had extra materials that would just go to waste. But this morning was different. This morning, she discovered a brand new water pump installed beside her cabin, gleaming brass fittings catching the early sunlight like scattered coins. She was still staring at it in amazement when Colton rode up, affecting an air of casual surprise at finding her there. "Morning, Mrs. Vega. Fine day for—" He paused, following her gaze to the pump. "Well, would you look at that? Seems someone's been busy." Someone, indeed. Marisol turned to face him, hands planted on her hips, despite the awkwardness of her condition. "This is too much, Mr. McRae. Far too much." He dismounted slowly, his expression carefully neutral. "Don't rightly know what you mean. Pumps have a way of appearing when they're needed. Mysterious thing, really. Mysterious." She tried for sternness, but couldn't quite suppress the smile tugging at her lips. "And I suppose you had nothing to do with it?" "Well, I might have mentioned to Hutchins that someone in the area was having pump troubles. Might have suggested he order some parts. Could be he misunderstood and thought I was placing an order myself. A very expensive misunderstanding." The way I see it," Colton said, moving to examine the pump with exaggerated interest. "A working water source increases property value. Makes good business sense to ensure the neighborhood maintains proper standards." It was such a transparent fiction that Marisol found herself laughing, despite her concern about accepting such generosity. "And what exactly do you expect in return for this misunderstanding?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond plumbing repairs. They'd been dancing around something for weeks now. A careful courtship conducted, through shared work and gradual intimacy, but neither had been willing to name what was growing between them. Colton was quiet for a long moment, his hands resting on the pump handle as he seemed to weigh his words. "I expect you to use it," he said finally. "I expect you to stop risking your health and that baby's welfare by hauling water from the creek. And I expect—" He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "I expect you to stop thinking of every kindness as a debt that needs repaying." Easy words for a man who's never had to depend on charity. "Is that what you think this is?" His voice carried a note of hurt that surprised them both. "Charity." Marisol studied his face, seeing something there that made her reconsider her assumption. "What would you call it?" "Investment," he said quietly, "in something I'm hoping might grow into more than just neighborly assistance." The honesty in his words sent warmth spreading through her chest, followed immediately by a familiar surge of panic. She'd been here before, trusted before, allowed herself to believe in promises that dissolved like morning mist when circumstances changed. She walked to her trunk inside the cabin and withdrew the tattered wedding dress she'd worn to marry Miguel, holding the faded silk up to the light streaming through her single window. The fabric, once white as fresh snow, had yellowed with age and poor storage. The delicate embroidery her mother had spent months perfecting was coming loose in places, threads hanging like broken promises. "I wore this when I married Miguel," she said, not looking at Colton, who had followed her inside. "My mother spent our entire savings on the silk, worked every evening for 6 months on the embroidery. She said a woman should look like a queen. On her wedding day, even if she'd live like a peasant afterward." Colton remained respectfully silent, understanding that she was offering him something important. "He promised me so many things," she continued, her fingers tracing the delicate threadwork. "A proper house, security, children who would never know want. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was staying in. My father's house forever, becoming the spinster daughter who cared for aging parents. But he left. He left." She folded the dress carefully, as if it were something precious rather than a symbol of broken dreams. "Not just physically, emotionally. He'd been leaving for months before he actually rode away. I could see it in his eyes, the way he stopped really listening when I spoke, stopped making plans that included both of us. And now you're afraid the same thing will happen again. It wasn't a question, and she appreciated that he didn't try to offer false reassurances or protestations of his own reliability. Instead, he simply acknowledged her fear as reasonable, given her experience. "The baby isn't Miguel's," she said, suddenly surprising herself with the admission. "The timing doesn't work, not if you count carefully. I haven't told anyone else that, haven't even let myself think about it much. But you should know, if we're going to—" She gestured helplessly, unable to finish the thought. "If we're going to what?" Colton asked gently. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't know what this is between us, or what it might become. I only know that I'm tired of being afraid all the time, tired of assuming the worst about everyone's motives." He stepped closer, close enough that she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. "The baby's father. Do you want to tell me about that?" She shook her head. "It doesn't matter who he was. What matters is that this child will be mine, will carry my name and my love. Everything else is just history." "Then that's all I need to know." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face gently in his weathered hands. "I'm not Miguel, Marisol. I'm not going anywhere." "You can't promise that," she whispered. "No one can promise that." "You're right," he agreed. "I can't promise I won't die, or that circumstances won't change in ways neither of us can predict. But I can promise that I won't choose to leave. I can promise that whatever we build together, I'll fight to protect it." When he kissed her, it was with the careful tenderness of a man who understood that trust was earned in small increments, not grand gestures. She kissed him back, tasting possibility and hope, feeling the baby stir between them as if offering blessing to this new beginning. Outside, the new pump stood ready to provide water whenever she needed it, a symbol of practical care that somehow meant more than flowers or poetry ever could. And for the first time since Miguel's departure, Marisol allowed herself to imagine a future that included genuine partnership, shared burdens, and the radical notion that she might deserve to be truly loved. The baby cradle sat in the far corner of Colton's barn, covered by a canvas top and surrounded by carefully stacked hay bales that formed a protective barrier around it. Marisol discovered it by accident while searching for eggs from the bantam hens that had taken to laying in odd corners rather than their designated nesting boxes. She'd been reaching behind a bale when her hand brushed against the smooth wood of what was obviously fine craftsmanship. She pulled away the tarp with trembling fingers, revealing a piece of furniture that took her breath away. The cradle was carved from what appeared to be cherry wood, its surface polished to a warm glow, despite years of neglect. Every detail spoke of painstaking care, the gentle curves of the rockers, the intricate leaf pattern carved along the headboard, the tiny wooden pegs that held it together without a single nail or screw. "He was going to be born in November." Colton's voice came from behind her, quiet and thick with memory. "I started working on it the day Sarah told me she was expecting. Figured I had plenty of time to get it perfect." Marisol turned to find him standing in the barn doorway, silhouetted against the afternoon light. His expression was carefully controlled, but she could see the pain he carried just beneath the surface. "It's beautiful," she said softly. "Perfect. Took me 4 months to carve all those leaves. Sarah used to tease me about it, said the baby wouldn't care if the cradle was fancy as long as it was safe and warm." He approached slowly, running, his hand along the smooth rail. "I wanted it to be something that would last, something that could be passed down through generations." "Why didn't you finish it?" "Thomas died 3 days before I planned to apply the final coat of finish. After that, I couldn't." He shrugged, the gesture encompassing all the grief that words couldn't hold. "Seemed wrong to complete something. For a child who'd never use it. Marisol felt tears gathering in her eyes, understanding the weight of love and loss that this cradle represented. She placed her hand on the carved headboard, imagining the hours Colton had spent working on each detail, the hopes and dreams he'd carved into every curve and line. "He would have loved it," she said. "Any baby would. I used to think about that, about him sleeping in it, growing big enough that his feet would hang over the sides. About teaching him to carve his own toys someday." Colton's voice grew rough with emotion. "Sometimes I still come out here and picture it." They stood in silence for several minutes, both lost in thoughts of children who existed only in memory and imagination. Outside, the wind whistled through the barn's eaves, carrying the scent of approaching autumn and the promise of winter's challenges ahead. "I've been thinking," Colton said eventually, "about what you said regarding courage being a choice, about choosing it day by day. What about it? I want to make you a proposition, a formal one this time, not wrapped up in stories about broken pumps and wayward mules." Marisol felt her heart begin to race, though she tried to keep her expression calm. "What kind of proposition?" "Marriage," he said simply. "A real partnership, not just the kind of arrangement people make for convenience or protection." The word hung between them like a bridge across dangerous territory, one that could bear their weight and carry them to safety, or collapse and send them both tumbling into unknown depths. "You're asking me to marry you," she said, needing to hear the words spoken clearly. "I am. Before the baby comes, before winter sets in, before either of us has time to lose our nerve." He stepped closer, his eyes serious but warm. "I know it's fast. I know there are 100 reasons why it might not work. But I also know that what we've built these past weeks feels more real than anything I've experienced since Sarah died." A town will have opinions," she said, though her heart was already leaning toward yes. "The town can go to hell," he replied with such vehemence that it surprised them both. "Pardon the language, but I'm tired of living my life according to other people's narrow ideas about what's proper or acceptable. And if the baby comes early, if there are complications, then we'll face them together. Mrs. Henderson has already agreed to move into the spare room for the last month of your pregnancy. The house is big enough, warm enough, safe enough for a family." Marisol found herself thinking of all the practical advantages he offered: security, comfort, protection from both winter weather and social judgment. But beneath those considerations ran something deeper, a growing certainty that this man understood both her strength and her vulnerabilities in ways that Miguel never had. "What about love?" she asked quietly. "What about the fact that neither of us is ready for that kind of emotional risk? What about it?" He reached for her hands, holding them gently in his calloused palms. "I'm not asking you to love me tomorrow, Marisol. I'm asking you to build something with me that might become love, given time and care and mutual respect. Marriage of partnership first, affection second. A marriage of equals," he corrected. "Two people who've both learned that survival is easier when you're not facing the world alone." She looked down at their joined hands, his large and weathered from years of ranch work, hers smaller but equally marked by labor and determination. They fit together well, she thought. Not perfectly. Perfection was the stuff of romantic novels. Not real life, but well enough to build something lasting. "The cradle," she said, gesturing toward the beautiful piece of furniture behind them. "Would you finish it? For this baby?" "For our baby," he corrected gently. "If you'll have me, this child will be mine in every way that matters. And yes, I'll finish it. It's time." "Then yes," she said, the word coming out stronger and more certain than she'd expected. "Yes, I'll marry you, Colton McRae. I'll be your partner, and you'll be mine, and we'll see what we can build together." When he kissed her this time, it was with the solemnity of a vow, a promise sealed between two people who'd learned that the best foundations were built not on passion or desperation, but on mutual respect and shared determination to create something better than what they'd lost. Outside, the first frost of the season was already touching the grass, warning that winter's challenges were not far away. But inside the barn, surrounded by the tools and materials that would complete a cradle meant for new life, Marisol and Colton began planning a future that honored their past wounds while opening the door to healing they'd both thought impossible. The gossip would be fierce, they knew. The judgment swift and harsh. But they'd faced worse than small-town disapproval, and they'd face whatever came next together. Two survivors who discovered that sometimes the best kind of love was the kind that grew slowly, nurtured by daily choices rather than grand gestures, rooted in partnership rather than dependence. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early October, carried by a rider who'd been paid extra to ensure its swift delivery from the railroad depot in Cedar Falls. Marisol was hanging laundry behind her cabin when she heard the horse approaching, and something in the urgency of the hoofbeats made her stomach clench with foreboding. The envelope was addressed in Miguel's familiar handwriting, her name written in the confident script she'd once found so appealing. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it, aware that whatever news it contained would likely change everything about the fragile happiness she'd been building with Colton. "My beloved Marisol," the letter began, and she had to sit down heavily on her wooden step before continuing. "Fortune has smiled upon us at last. The railroad work has paid better than we ever dreamed, and I've secured contracts that will make us wealthy beyond our modest hopes. I write to you now from Denver, where I've purchased property and established myself in the freight business. The house I've bought for us has 7 rooms and indoor plumbing, everything we dreamed of and more. I know you must be angry with me for staying away so long, but you'll understand when you see what I've accomplished. A man must sometimes sacrifice comfort to secure his family's future, and that sacrifice has borne fruit beyond our wildest expectations. I'm returning to claim what's mine, my wife, my child, and the homestead that will serve as the foundation for our expanded enterprise. I should arrive by the end of October, in time for the birth of our son. I've brought legal documents to establish clear ownership of our property and to ensure that no one can question my rights as your husband and the father of your child. Prepare yourself for a new life, my dear. Our struggles are over. Your devoted husband, Miguel Guerrero. Marisol read the letter twice, then a third time, each reading making the words feel more unreal rather than clearer. Miguel was returning, and he was coming with money, legal documents, and assumptions that made her blood run cold. He spoke of claiming what was his, as if she were property to be collected, referred to her unborn child as his son despite the mathematical impossibility, and wrote with the casual confidence of a man who'd never doubted his welcome. She was still sitting on her step, staring at the letter, when Colton rode up for their afternoon meeting about wedding preparations. One look at her face told him something was drastically wrong. What's happened? He dismounted quickly and approached her with the careful urgency of someone expecting bad news. She handed him the letter without a word, watching his expression darken as he read Miguel's presumptuous words. When he finished, his jaw was set, in a way that reminded her he'd once been a soldier. "Well," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "this complicates things. He's coming back, Colton, with money and legal papers and expectations that—" She pressed her hands to her belly, feeling the baby shift restlessly as if sensing her distress. "He thinks this child is his. He's planned our entire future without asking what I might want. What do you want?" The question was simple, direct, and somehow exactly what she needed to hear. "I want to marry you this Sunday as we planned. I want to build the life we've been talking about. I want this baby to grow up with a father who chose to love him, not one who claims him as property." Her voice grew stronger with each declaration. "I don't want to go back to being Miguel Guerrero's wife." "Then you won't," Colton said with quiet finality. "But we need to understand what we're up against. You said he's bringing legal documents? He seems to think the homestead belongs to him, even though it's filed under my name. And he's assuming the baby. She trailed off, unable to voice the complications that Miguel's return would create. "The baby's mine," Colton said firmly. "In every way that matters, this child is mine. Whatever biological facts Miguel thinks he can claim, they don't change." They were interrupted by the sound of another horse approaching at speed. This time, it was young Billy Henderson from town, his face flushed with the importance of his message. "Mr. McRae, Mrs. Vega," he called, sliding down from his horse with youthful agility. "My ma sent me to warn you. There's strangers in town, asking questions about Mrs. Vega. Rough-looking men, not the type we usually see around here." Colton's expression sharpened. "How many men?" "3, maybe 4. They're saying they work for someone named Guerrero, that they're here to make sure his property's protected." Billy's young face showed confusion about the implications, but he'd clearly understood the seriousness of the situation. "Ma thought you should know right away." After Billy left with a silver dollar for his trouble, Marisol and Colton sat in her cabin's growing darkness, planning for a confrontation neither had wanted but both could see approaching like a prairie storm. "He's not the same man who left," Marisol said quietly. "The Miguel I married would never have hired men to intimidate people. Money's changed him. Or maybe it's just revealed who he really was underneath the charm." "Men with something to lose often become dangerous when they think that something's being threatened," Colton observed. "The question is, what exactly does he think he's losing?" "Control," she said immediately. "Miguel always needed to feel like he was in charge, like he was the one making decisions for both of us. My independence these past months, the fact that I've survived and even thrived without him, that threatens everything he believes about himself. And the baby represents his legacy, his immortality. He won't care about the biological facts if they don't suit his narrative." She stood and moved to the window, watching the sun set over the prairie that had become her sanctuary. "He'll fight for this child, because in his mind, that child belongs to him. Then we'll have to make sure he understands that he's wrong," Colton said, his voice carrying the steel that had once made him an effective military scout. "I've dealt with men like this before. Men who think might makes right, who confuse ownership with love." As if summoned by their conversation, the baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, making Marisol gasp and place both hands on her belly. Colton was beside her instantly, his hands covering hers, feeling the life they'd both chosen to protect. "He doesn't get to claim this," Marisol said fiercely. "This baby, this life we're building, Miguel gave up any right to it when he rode away. Then we make sure he understands that," Colton replied. "Whatever it takes." Outside, the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, their light seeming fragile against the vast darkness of the prairie night. But inside the cabin, two people who'd learned to fight for what mattered, prepared to defend the future they'd chosen together, knowing that the real battle was just beginning. Miguel Guerrero arrived in Cedar Falls like a storm front, bringing with him an entourage that transformed the quiet frontier town into something altogether more dangerous. 3 hard-faced men accompanied him, not cowboys or railroad workers, but the kind of hired muscle that prospered in mining camps and cattle. Towns where disputes were settled with fists and firearms rather than law and reason. Colton observed them from the window of Hutchins' general store, where he'd positioned himself to gather intelligence about Miguel's intentions. The man who dismounted from the lead horse bore little resemblance to the charming dreamer Marisol had described. This Miguel wore expensive clothes and carried himself with the aggressive confidence of someone accustomed to getting his way through intimidation. Money, it seemed, had not improved his character so much as amplified its worst aspects. "That's him," whispered Mrs. Hutchins, joining Colton at the window. "Guerrero, been asking around about his wife and property like he owns half the territory. His men have been making folks nervous, asking pointed questions about who's been helping Mrs. Vega." Colton watched Miguel enter the saloon, his hired men taking positions that allowed them to observe the street while their employer conducted whatever business had brought them to town. Everything about their deployment spoke of military-style planning, suggesting that Miguel had learned more than freight management during his time away. "What's the mood in town?" Colton asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Divided," Mrs. Hutchins admitted. "Some folks think a woman's place is with her husband, regardless of circumstances. Others remember how hard Mrs. Vega's worked, how she's conducted herself with dignity despite everything." She paused, studying Colton's tense expression. "And some are wondering what a prosperous rancher like yourself is planning to do about the situation." It was a delicate way of asking whether he intended to fight for Marisol or step aside to avoid trouble. Colton appreciated the diplomacy, even as he recognized the test behind the question. "I'm planning to marry her this Sunday," he said clearly, knowing the words would spread through town within hours. "Mrs. Vega has made her choice, and I intend to honor it." Mrs. Hutchins nodded approvingly. "Good. She deserves better than what that man put her through, and everyone with eyes can see you've been taking proper care of her." But as Colton rode back toward his ranch, he reflected grimly on how little proper care might matter if Miguel chose to press his legal claims through force rather than law. The men he'd brought weren't hired for their knowledge of territorial marriage statutes. At the ranch, he found Marisol in the kitchen, methodically preparing meals that could be preserved and stored, the actions of a woman preparing for siege. Her movements were calm and efficient, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she startled slightly when he entered. "How close are the contractions?" he asked, recognizing the signs of early labor that she was trying to hide. "Close enough," she admitted, pausing to breathe through a wave of discomfort. "The baby's decided this is the perfect time to make an appearance." Colton felt his blood chill. Of all the complications they'd anticipated, having Marisol go into labor while Miguel was in town with armed men ranked among the worst possible timing. "We need to get Mrs. Henderson," he said, moving toward the door. "Already sent word," Marisol replied, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "She should be here within the hour." But Colton, she reached for his hand as another contraction gripped her. "If something happens, if Miguel tries to take the baby, that's not going to happen," he said firmly. "Whatever else occurs, that child is going to be born safe and free." Mrs. Henderson arrived as promised, her midwife's bag in one hand and a determined expression that brooked no argument about the seriousness of the situation. She'd delivered babies under frontier conditions for 30 years and had seen enough of life's complications to remain calm in almost any crisis. "How far apart are the pains?" she asked Marisol. "All business, despite the extraordinary circumstances." "Every few minutes now," Marisol replied, gripping the kitchen table as another. Contraction seized her. "Then we'd best get you settled upstairs," Mrs. Henderson said briskly. "Mr. McRae, I'll need hot water, clean towels, and—" She paused, glancing toward the window where the sound of approaching horses could be heard. "And perhaps you'd better see to whatever that is before it becomes a distraction." Through the window, Colton could see Miguel riding up the lane with two of his men, their approach deliberately intimidating in its confidence. They'd come to assert Miguel's claims, apparently unconcerned about Colton's presence or the impropriety of their timing. "Get her upstairs," Colton told Mrs. Henderson, his voice carrying the authority of command. "Bar the door and don't open it for anyone but me." He stepped onto the porch as Miguel dismounted, noting how the man's expensive clothes couldn't quite disguise the hard edge that money and power had given him. This was no longer the dreamy charmer who'd swept Marisol away with promises of prosperity. This was someone who'd learned to take what he wanted through force and intimidation. "Guerrero," Colton said evenly, his hand resting casually near his gun belt. "You're on private property." "McRae," Miguel replied with a confidence that suggested he'd done research on his opposition. "I've come for my wife and child. I trust you won't interfere with a man reclaiming his family." "Your wife is in labor," Colton said bluntly. "Whatever business you think you have here can wait until after the baby's born safely." Miguel's expression shifted, calculation replacing bravado as he processed this information. "All the more reason to assert my rights immediately. That child is a guerrero, and I won't have him born under another man's roof. That child is going to be born where it's safest, Colton replied, his voice carrying a warning that made Miguel's hired men shift nervously. Which happens to be here, with a qualified midwife and proper facilities. You seem to have developed strong opinions about my family, Miguel said, his tone deceptively mild. Perhaps we should discuss this inside, where my wife can participate in decisions about her future. Perhaps you should understand that the woman upstairs made her decisions months ago, when you abandoned her to face the frontier alone. Colton stepped forward slightly, a movement that conveyed both threat and absolute resolve. She's chosen to marry me, Guerrero, this Sunday with the blessing of the church and the community. Impossible, Miguel snapped, his composure finally cracking. She's my wife, bound by law and sacred vows. No territorial court would recognize such a travesty. Then I guess we'll find out what the law has to say about a man who abandons his pregnant wife for half a year, won't we? From inside the house came a sound that made both men freeze. Marisol's voice, raised in the unmistakable cadence of hard labor. Whatever legal and personal disputes lay between them, life was asserting its own urgent timeline. She needs to be in a proper hospital, Miguel said, but his voice lacked conviction. They all knew the nearest hospital was 2 days' ride away. She needs to be left alone to deliver safely, Colton corrected, which means you and your men need to leave. Now, I won't be driven from my own child's birth, Miguel declared, but he made no move toward the house. You'll be driven from whatever threatens the safety of that mother and baby, Colton replied, with quiet steel. Test me on that, and you'll discover exactly how far I'm willing to go to protect them. As if to emphasize his words, the wind began to pick up, carrying the scent of snow and the promise of one of the brutal early blizzards that could trap travelers for days. Winter was coming fast, and everyone present understood that the coming storm would force decisions that couldn't be delayed or negotiated. Inside the house, Mrs. Henderson's voice could be heard offering steady encouragement to Marisol, the sound of new life fighting to enter a world that seemed determined to complicate its arrival. And outside, 2 men faced each other across a divide that couldn't be bridged with words, while the first snowflakes began to fall like scattered promises of the battle yet to come. The blizzard struck with the sudden ferocity that made Dakota Territory winters legendary among those who survived them. Within minutes, the wind transformed from a gentle promise of snow into a howling beast that reduced visibility to mere feet and drove ice crystals with enough force to blind anyone foolish enough to face it directly. Inside the ranch house, Mrs. Henderson had transformed Colton's master bedroom into a makeshift birthing chamber, using the quilt that had once covered his marriage bed with Sarah to create a nest of warmth and comfort for Marisol. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. New life entering the world in the same space where Colton had once dreamed of children with another woman. The contractions are getting stronger, Mrs. Henderson reported when Colton checked on their progress. This baby's not waiting for the weather to clear or for anyone to sort out their disputes. Nature's got its own timeline. Through the bedroom window, Colton could see the dim shapes of Miguel and his men taking shelter in the barn. They'd been caught by the storm's sudden intensity, making immediate departure impossible, even if Miguel had been inclined to honor Colton's demand that he leave. For better or worse, they were all trapped together until the weather cleared. "How is she?" Colton asked, keeping his voice low to avoid disturbing Marisol during a brief respite between contractions. "Strong," Mrs. Henderson said simply. "Scared, which is natural, but strong. She's been asking for you." Colton entered the bedroom quietly, finding Marisol propped against a nest of pillows, her face flushed with exertion, but her eyes alert and determined. She reached for his hand as soon as she saw him, gripping it with surprising strength. "The storm," she said, breathlessly. "Miguel can't leave now, can he?" "Not until it passes," Colton admitted. "But he can't get to the house either, not in this wind. The barn's solid. They'll be safe enough there. And the baby." Mrs. Henderson says it's coming soon. Soon enough, he agreed, brushing damp hair back from her forehead. Are you afraid? Terrified, she said honestly. Not of the birth. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time, but of what happens after, of what Miguel will try to claim. Another contraction seized her, and Colton found himself holding her hand while she breathed through the pain, marveling at her strength, even as he worried about the complications that lay ahead. When it passed, she looked at him with an intensity that cut through his concerns about everything except the immediate moment. Promise me something, she said urgently. Whatever happens, whatever Miguel threatens or claims, promise me this child will know who chose to be its father. I promise. He said without hesitation, this baby is ours, Marisol. Nothing Miguel says or does can change that. Mrs. Henderson bustled back into the room, carrying fresh towels and wearing the expression of someone who delivered enough babies to recognize when events were approaching their climax. Time to get serious about this business, she announced. Mr. McRae, I need you to help support her during the next few contractions. As if summoned by the midwife's words, they heard the sound of the barn door being forced open against the wind, followed by shouts that carried even through the storm's fury. Miguel's voice rose above the wind, angry and demanding, though the words were lost in the blizzard's roar. He's trying to get to the house, Colton realized, moving toward the window. Let him try, Mrs. Henderson said grimly. No sane man ventures out in weather like this. If he's fool enough to attempt it, the storm will teach him better sense than... We can! But even as she spoke, they could see a lantern's dim glow moving erratically across the yard, fighting against wind that threatened to extinguish it entirely. Miguel was indeed attempting to cross the distance between barn and house, driven by desperation or determination that overrode common sense. He'll die out there, Marisol said, her voice tight with a mixture of concern and anger. Stubborn fool. Always thought he could force the world to bend to his will. Colton was torn between his protective instincts toward Marisol and the reluctant recognition that he couldn't simply let a man freeze to death on his property regardless of their personal disputes. But before he could make a decision, the lantern's glow disappeared entirely, swallowed by the storm's white fury. There, Mrs. Henderson said with satisfaction. Storms made the decision for us. Now let's focus on the business at hand. The next hour passed in a blur of increasing urgency as Marisol's labor progressed, with the relentless rhythm of forces beyond human control. Between contractions, they listened to the wind's assault on the house, the sound of shutters rattling and timbers creaking under nature's onslaught. The storm seemed determined to mark this birth with its own dramatic intensity. I can see the head, Mrs. Henderson announced suddenly, her voice carrying the excitement that never quite faded, even after decades of attending births. A few more pushes, dear, and we'll have ourselves a baby. Marisol bore down with fierce determination, her face a mask of concentration and effort that transformed her into something primal and powerful. Colton found himself holding his breath, caught between wonder at the miracle unfolding before him and anxiety about the challenges that would follow. One more, Mrs. Henderson urged. One good push, and there! The baby emerged in a rush of fluid and motion, immediately filling the room with the unmistakable sound of new life protesting its abrupt transition from womb to world. The cry was strong and indignant, speaking of healthy lungs and a robust constitution that would serve. Well, in the harsh realities of frontier life, a girl, Mrs. Henderson announced with satisfaction, quickly clearing the baby's airways and wrapping her in the soft blanket that had been warming by the fire. Perfect little girl, with a voice like an opera singer. Marisol reached for her daughter, with trembling hands, tears streaming down her face as she gathered the tiny bundle against her chest. The baby's cries subsided to small, questioning sounds as she found herself in her mother's arms, dark eyes opening to stare with the unfocused wonder of the newly born. She's beautiful, Colton said softly, studying the miniature features that were already showing hints of character and personality. Perfect. She is, Marisol agreed, her voice thick with emotion, and she's ours. But even as they marveled at the miracle they'd witnessed, the sound of heavy footsteps on the porch reminded them that their challenges were far from over. Miguel had somehow survived the storm's attempt to claim him, and judging by the fury in his approach, his brush with death had only strengthened his determination to assert his claims. The front door burst open with enough force to rattle the windows, bringing with it a swirl of snow, and the ice-covered figure of a man pushed beyond the limits of reason by obsession and wounded pride. Miguel Guerrero had crossed the storm-lashed yard through sheer, stubborn will, and now he stood in Colton's house, demanding recognition of rights that existed only in his own mind. "Where is she?" he shouted, ice crystals falling from his beard. As his voice carried through the house, "Where is my wife and my son?" Miguel's entrance was like a blast of Arctic fury made human, his clothes encrusted with ice and his eyes wild with the kind of desperation that made rational men dangerous. He stood dripping in the foyer, scanning the house with the predatory intensity of someone ready to tear apart anything that stood between him and what he believed belonged to him. "You have a daughter," Colton said quietly, appearing at the top of the stairs with his hand resting pointedly on his gun belt. "Born healthy and strong, no thanks to your timing." "A daughter?" Miguel's face contorted with confusion and something that might have been disappointment. "But the child should be—" The timing was— He trailed off, calculation replacing fury as he processed information that didn't align with his assumptions. "The timing was exactly right," Colton continued, descending the stairs with deliberate slowness. "For a child conceived after you abandoned her mother, the mathematics are quite clear if you care to count the months." The implications hit Miguel like a physical blow. His carefully constructed narrative, the loyal husband returning to claim his family, the heir to his newfound fortune, crumbled in the face of simple arithmetic. The baby couldn't be his, which meant his legal claims were built on false premises. But rather than retreating in the face of this revelation, Miguel's expression hardened into something more dangerous than disappointed entitlement. A man who'd crossed a blizzard on foot wasn't likely to be deterred by inconvenient facts. "Doesn't matter," he said, his voice carrying a new edge of desperation. "She's still my wife, still bound by vows that no territorial magistrate can dissolve." "Without cause. Abandonment seems like cause enough," Colton replied evenly. "And she's chosen to end those vows, Miguel. Chosen to build a life with someone who won't disappear at the first sign of difficulty." From upstairs came the sound of the baby crying, a thin, demanding wail that spoke of hunger and the basic needs of new life. The sound seemed to galvanize Miguel, reminding him of what he'd come to claim. "I want to see her," he demanded. "My wife. I want to hear from her own lips that she's rejecting everything we built together." "What you built together was a homestead and broken promises," Colton said. But he stepped aside to allow Miguel access to the stairs. "Mrs. Henderson is with her. You'll conduct yourself with respect, or you'll find yourself back in that storm faster than you can argue about it." Miguel climbed the stairs with the careful intensity of a man approaching something he both wanted and feared to confront. Behind him, Colton followed at a distance that would allow quick intervention if the situation turned violent. In the bedroom, Marisol looked up from nursing her daughter as Miguel appeared in the doorway. Her face showed exhaustion from the birth, but also a steel-spined determination that hadn't been there when he'd left months ago. This wasn't the uncertain young woman he'd abandoned. This was someone who'd learned her own strength through necessity. "Miguel," she said simply, her voice carrying neither welcome nor hostility, "you look like you've had a difficult journey." "Marisol." He approached the bed slowly, his eyes fixed on the bundle in her arms. "The baby. Is it—" "She's healthy," Marisol said, unconsciously tightening her hold on the infant. "Born just an hour ago." She Miguel seemed to be struggling with the reality of the situation. I had hoped, I had planned for a son. Children have a way of making their own plans, Mrs. Henderson observed dryly from her position by the wash basin. This little one certainly chose her own timing. Miguel moved closer to the bed, and for a moment his expression softened as he looked down at the tiny face barely visible within the blanket's folds. "She's beautiful," he said quietly. "Perfect. She is," Marisol agreed. "And she's not yours." The words hung in the air, like a challenge thrown down between them. Miguel's face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, anger, and finally a cold calculation that reminded everyone present why he'd brought armed men with him. "You've been with him," he said, gesturing toward Colton without looking. "Away from Marisol. While I was working to build us a future, you were playing house with the local cattle baron. While you were building yourself a future," Marisol corrected, her voice growing stronger. "I was surviving alone, learning that I'm stronger than I ever knew, discovering what it means to be valued rather than owned. I never owned you, didn't you?" She shifted the baby to her other arm, wincing slightly from the movement. "Every decision made for both of us, every plan that assumed my compliance without asking for my opinion, that sounds like ownership to me." Miguel's jaw tightened. "I provided for you, protected you, gave you everything a woman could want. You gave me promises," she said simply. "Colton gave me partnership." The baby chose that moment to let out another demanding cry, and Marisol automatically began the gentle rocking motion that seemed to soothe the infant's distress. The sound and sight of maternal care seemed to pierce through Miguel's anger, revealing something vulnerable underneath the bluster. "I came back," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I came back with everything I promised. Money, property, security, everything we dreamed of. You came back with everything you dreamed of," Marisol corrected gently. "But I've learned to dream for myself now. And my dreams include a man who chose to stay when staying was difficult, not one who returns when it's convenient. So that's it." Miguel's voice began to rise again. "Years of marriage, all our plans, everything we meant to each other. You'll throw it all away for a few months of charity from a lonely widower?" "I'll choose it all," Marisol said firmly, "for a lifetime of genuine partnership with a good man." Miguel turned to face Colton, his expression twisted with a mixture of grief and rage that made him unpredictable. "You think you've won something. Here, you think taking another man's wife makes you some kind of hero. I think helping a woman survive and thrive makes me a decent human being," Colton replied calmly. "And I think respecting her choices makes me a better man than one who assumes he can claim her like property." "We'll see about that," Miguel snarled, his hand moving toward the gun at his hip. But before he could draw, the sound of splintering wood came from downstairs, followed by shouts of alarm. Miguel's hired men, apparently tired of waiting in the barn, had forced their way into the house and were now making their presence known with the kind of violence that turned disputes into tragedies. The baby's cries intensified, as if sensing the tension in the room, and Mrs. Henderson moved protectively closer to Marisol's bedside. In the space of a heartbeat, what had been a painful but civil confrontation transformed into something far more dangerous, with new life caught helplessly in the center of forces that cared nothing for innocence or hope. The crash of breaking. Furniture from downstairs galvanized everyone in the bedroom into action. Colton's military training asserted itself immediately. Protect the civilians, control the terrain, eliminate the threat with minimal collateral damage. "Mrs. Henderson, get them into the corner farthest from the door," he commanded quietly, drawing his revolver with the smooth efficiency of long practice. "Miguel, if you want to prove you're a man worth anything, now's the time to help protect what you claim to love." For a moment, Miguel seemed frozen between competing loyalties, his desire to assert dominance over Marisol and the more fundamental need to defend innocence from violence. The sound of his hired men shouting threats from below apparently decided the matter. "I never told them to break into the house," he said, his face pale with the realization that events had spiraled beyond his control. "I just wanted them to ensure my rights were respected." "Then help me ensure everyone survives the next few minutes," Colton said grimly, moving toward the bedroom door. "We'll sort out rights and wrongs after we deal with immediate threats." Baby's cries had subsided to small, frightened whimpers that seemed to sense the danger surrounding her. Marisol clutched her daughter protectively, her exhaustion from childbirth warring with fierce maternal instincts that would defend her child regardless of personal cost. "There's a shotgun in the wardrobe," she told Colton quietly. "Sarah's. She always said a frontier woman should know how to protect her home." Colton retrieved the weapon, checking its load with practiced efficiency before handing it to Miguel. "You know how to use this?" "Well enough," Miguel replied, accepting the shotgun with obvious reluctance. "But those are my men down there." "Those are armed men threatening a woman who just gave birth and a newborn child," Colton corrected harshly. "Whatever arrangement you had with them ended when they decided to use force in a house with innocents." Heavy footsteps on the stairs announced that the confrontation was about to become immediate. Colton positioned himself beside the doorway, his revolver ready but held low to avoid accidentally endangering anyone in the room behind him. "Guerrero!" one of the men shouted from the hallway. "You've been up there long enough. Time to collect. What's yours and settle accounts with this interfering rancher?" "Stand down, Morrison," Miguel called back, his voice carrying new authority. "The situation has changed." "Like hell it has," came the reply. "We didn't ride through a blizzard and break into this house to leave empty-handed. Your woman and that baby are coming with us, and McRae's going to pay for his interference." "The baby isn't mine," Miguel said loudly, the admission seeming to cost him something essential. "The dates don't match. She belongs to McRae." Silence greeted this revelation, followed by Morrison's harsh laughter. "Don't matter whose brat it is, you paid us to secure your property, and that's what we're going to do. A man's wife belongs to him regardless of whose child she's carrying." "Not this woman," Colton said, stepping into the doorway with his gun raised. "Not anymore." Morrison was a hard-faced man with the kind of scars that spoke of violence as a profession rather than necessity. He held a rifle with casual competence, but his eyes showed the calculation of someone trying to determine if the potential reward justified the obvious risk. 4 against 1 aren't bad odds, Morrison observed, even if you are supposed to be some kind of war hero. 3 against 2, Miguel said quietly, stepping up beside Colton with the shotgun cradled in his arms. "And the woman's under my protection as well as his." Morrison's expression shifted to include surprise and betrayal. "You hired us, Guerrero. Paid good money to ensure your rights were respected. I hired you to escort me safely and help me reclaim my family," Miguel replied, his voice growing steadier with each word. "I didn't hire you to threaten a new mother and child. There's a difference between asserting legal rights and committing crimes." "Legal rights?" Morrison spat. "Hell, you don't even want the woman anymore, do you? Found out the baby ain't yours, and decided she's not worth the trouble. I found out she's stronger and braver than I ever deserved," Miguel said simply, "and that sometimes the right thing to do is step aside and let better men take care of what you failed to protect." The admission hung in the air between them, carrying the weight of genuine recognition and hard-earned wisdom. But Morrison's patience for philosophical discussions had apparently reached its limit. "Touching," he snarled, raising his rifle. "But we're not riding away empty-handed after all this trouble." What happened next unfolded with the terrible swiftness of violence between men who understood that survival often came down to who acted first and most decisively. Morrison's rifle was halfway to his shoulder when Colton's revolver spoke, the shot echoing through the house like thunder. The hired gun collapsed with a look of surprise, his weapon clattering harmlessly to the floor. The remaining men faced with the reality of actual gunfire rather than theoretical intimidation. reconsidered their commitment to Morrison's vision of easy money. Within minutes, they were backing down the stairs with their hands visible and their weapons holstered, apparently deciding that whatever Miguel had paid them wasn't worth dying for. In the aftermath, as the sound of horses departing through the continuing storm faded into distance, the house settled into an exhausted quiet, broken only by the baby's occasional contented sounds. Mrs. Henderson bustled about, checking on everyone's condition, while Colton and Miguel found themselves standing awkwardly in the hallway sharing the strange camaraderie of men who'd faced danger together. "Thank you," Miguel said quietly, "for protecting them, for being what I should have been." "What will you do now?" Colton asked, though not unkindly. "Go back to Denver, I suppose. Try to build something worthwhile with the money I've earned." Miguel paused, looking toward the bedroom where Marisol was quietly nursing their daughter. "Maybe learn to be the kind of man who deserves a second chance with someone else someday." "That would be wise," Colton agreed. By spring, when the prairie awakened from winter's harsh sleep, the story of that night had become legend in Cedar Falls, embellished with each telling but rooted in the fundamental truth that sometimes good people had to fight to protect what mattered most. Marisol and Colton were married in the church on the first warm Sunday in May, with little Eleanor gurgling contentedly in the cradle that Colton had finally finished, polished to a warm glow and decorated with carved flowers that would have made his first wife proud. The town turned out for the ceremony, their initial reservations swept away by months of witnessing genuine partnership and shared devotion. Mrs. Henderson had stayed through the winter, helping with the baby and becoming something of a grandmother figure to Elena. She'd finally returned to her own home in town, but not before ensuring that both new parents understood the basics of childcare and the importance of supporting each other through the challenges ahead. The garden flourished under their joint care, providing vegetables enough to feed them, through another winter and surplus to share with neighbors who'd learned to see past surface differences to the character underneath. Rosie the mule had earned permanent retirement in Colton's pasture, having proved that sometimes the most valuable gifts came with no strings attached. On quiet evenings, as they sat on the porch watching Elena discover the world with the endless fascination of the very young, Marisol and Colton often spoke of the future they were building together, a partnership rooted in mutual respect, seasoned with growing love, and strengthened by the understanding that the best relationships were chosen daily rather than simply assumed. Miguel had kept his word, returning to Denver and sending occasional letters that spoke of business success and eventually a quiet courtship with a widow who appreciated directness over charm. His final letter had included a formal relinquishment of any claims to the homestead and a generous contribution toward Eleanor's future education, gestures that spoke of genuine growth and hard-earned wisdom. As the sun set over the prairie on their first wedding anniversary, painting the grassland in shades of gold and amber that reminded them both of that first day when everything had changed, Marisol carried water from the well with Elena balanced on her hip. But now Colton walked beside her, sharing the load as he'd promised, their shadows stretching long across the land they'd chosen to call home. The Dakota Territory remained a harsh and unforgiving place, but they'd learned that survival was easier when you didn't face the world alone. More than that, they'd discovered that sometimes the most beautiful things grew from the most unlikely soil. Love from necessity, family from choice, and hope from the simple recognition that every day offered new chances to build something better than what had come before. Elena's laughter echoed across the prairie as she reached for the evening stars, her small hands grasping at light that seemed just within reach. And in that sound, her parents heard the promise of all the tomorrows they'd chosen to face together,